To the world, she was America's angel. To 20th Century Fox, she was a prisoner. This is the horrifying true story of Shirley Temple, a 6-year-old girl who wasn't raised but broken. While she saved a bankrupt studio with her smile, they repaid her with torture. From the black box where she was locked in darkness on a block of ice to learn obedience, to the dentist chair where her baby teeth were ground down to perfection. Hollywood didn't protect their golden goose. They sacrificed her. Forget the fairy tale. This is the story of the grind. 20th Century Fox was not the juggernaut we know today. It was a sinking ship. The studio was hemorrhaging money, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, with executives sweating through their suits as the banks circled like sharks. They didn't just want a hit. They needed a savior. When they found Shirley, they didn't see a little girl with talent. They saw a gold mine. They saw a way to pay the electric bills, the salaries of thousands of stagehands, and the mortgages of the executives in the Hollywood Hills. The pressure placed on her tiny shoulders was absolute and terrifyingly simple. If Shirley didn't smile, the studio didn't eat. The cruel reality, however, is that a gold mine requires excavation, and a machine requires maintenance. The problem with building an empire on the back of a 6-year-old is that 6-year-olds are inconveniently human. They get tired, they get sick, they grow up. And, most disastrously for the continuity of a film production, they lose their baby teeth. For a normal child, a loose tooth is a rite of passage, a wiggly annoyance that ends with a coin under the pillow. For Shirley Temple, it was a breach of contract. A gap in that $1 million smile was a flaw in the product, a crack in the porcelain that threatened to break the illusion of eternal infancy. The studio could not wait for nature to take its slow, organic course. Time was money, and every hour of downtime cost thousands of dollars. So they sanctioned a form of body horror disguised as dentistry, a barbaric maintenance routine that would traumatize her for the rest of her life. When a tooth became loose, there was no gentle string tied to a doorknob. Shirley was marched to the studio dentist's chair, a place that smelled of antiseptic and fear. The directive from the top was clear. The smile must remain unbroken. If a baby tooth was jagged or imperfect, they didn't wait for it to fall out. The dentist would take his drill and grind the living tooth down. They filed her baby teeth into painful, narrow stumps, often without the mercy of anesthesia, reshaping her mouth to accommodate high-grade porcelain caps. It was cosmetic surgery performed on a first grader, a brutal architectural renovation of a child's mouth to ensure she looked like a drawing in a storybook rather than a flesh-and-blood human being. The pain was excruciating, a sharp vibrating agony that shot through her jaw and into her skull. But the show had to go on. If a tooth fell out unexpectedly on set during a take, the director didn't call cut to comfort her. They called for the flipper. This was a rigid false dental plate, essentially a cosmetic denture that was jammed hard into her bleeding, swollen gums. The pain was immediate and blinding, a throbbing reminder of her status as a commodity. But the command from the director's chair was always the same. Sparkle, Shirley, sparkle. And she did. She learned to smile through the taste of her own blood, masking the throbbing in her jaw with a mask of unbridled joy. This was the first lesson of her education. Her body did not belong to her. It belonged to Fox. This ownership extended far beyond her physical appearance. It seeped into the very architecture of her existence. Her mother, Gertrude Temple, was the gatekeeper, but she was less of a parent and more of a warden. Gertrude was a woman consumed by a specific suffocating paranoia. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby had sent a shockwave of terror through the wealthy elite of America, and Gertrude was convinced that Shirley, The most famous child on earth was the next target. This fear, while perhaps grounded in the reality of the era's crime waves, transformed Shirley's childhood into a high-security prison operation. Every time they stepped out in public, the dynamic was not one of a mother and daughter enjoying a day out. It was a bodyguard escorting a high-value target. Gertrude carried a loaded pistol in her handbag at all times. Shirley grew up with the heavy metallic knowledge that lethal force was always just a zipper pull away. She existed in a bizarre limbo between two violent extremes: the suffocating, screaming adoration of the mob who wanted to touch her, and the cold steel of her mother's gun ready to defend her. She was taught that the world was a dangerous place, that strangers were threats, and that her only safety lay within the fortified walls of the studio or the iron grip of her mother. But the studio was not a sanctuary. It was a factory, and the working conditions were Dickensian. The child labor laws of the 1930s were porous, flimsy things that the studio lawyers navigated with ease. Shirley worked hours that would have broken a grown man. She was on set before the sun came up and often left long after it had gone down. Her playtime was choreographed for newsreels. Her schooling was squeezed into the breathless minutes between lighting setups. She was surrounded by adults who depended on her for their livelihoods, creating a suffocating atmosphere of obligation. If she yawned, if she acted out, if she wanted to stop, she wasn't just being a brat. She was threatening the economy of the entire lot. To ensure this exhausted child remained compliant, the studio developed a system of psychological conditioning that makes the dental torture look almost humane by comparison. They needed a way to control her energy, to switch her on and off like a light bulb. They couldn't hit her. That would leave marks on the merchandise. So director David Butler and the studio heads devised a punishment straight out of a Gothic nightmare, a method so cruel and psychologically damaging that it borders on torture. They weaponized the dark. Deep in the corner of the cavernous, drafty soundstage, far away from the warmth of the arc lights, stood a soundproof isolation booth. It was a wooden box, heavy and airless. But the true horror wasn't the box itself. It was what they placed inside it. On the floor of this unlit cell, they placed a massive block of solid ice. This was the black box. Whenever Shirley lost focus, whenever she giggled too much during a serious take, or simply succumbed to the crushing exhaustion of an 18-hour workday, she was not given a nap. She was not given a hug. She was grabbed by the arm and marched across the stage. The threat was whispered in her ear, a trigger phrase that would haunt her dreams. "Do you want to go to the box?" If the behavior didn't correct itself instantly, she was shoved inside. The heavy door was slammed shut and locked. The darkness was absolute. It was a sensory deprivation tank designed for a toddler. Inside, the temperature dropped rapidly as the ice radiated its bone-chilling cold. She couldn't sit down because the floor was wet and freezing. She couldn't stand still because her legs were trembling from fatigue. She was trapped in a freezing void, slipping on the wet floor, crying out for her mother. But the soundproofing worked both ways. The box swallowed her screams. No one came. No one opened the door until the director decided she had learned her lesson. This was not discipline. This was Pavlovian conditioning, the same brutal methodology used to break wild animals for the circus. They were rewiring her brain, forging a neural pathway that equated silence, darkness, and solitude with sheer terror. They taught her that freedom was cold and lonely. They taught her that the only place she was safe, the only place she was warm, and the only place she was loved was under the searing heat of the studio lights, performing exactly as told. It worked with devastating efficiency. Shirley Temple became the most professional child actor in history. Critics marveled at her discipline, at her ability to memorize lines, and hit her marks with the precision of a veteran. They called it genius. They called it a gift. They didn't see that it was a survival mechanism. She wasn't dancing because she was happy. She was dancing because she was terrified of the dark box waiting in the shadows. She learned to dissociate, to separate the freezing, frightened girl inside from the glowing, tapping angel on the outside. She became a master of the performance, not just for the camera, but for her own survival. The tragedy of this conditioning was that it stripped her of the one thing her movies promised the world: innocence. A child who knows the feeling of a grinded tooth and the smell of a soundproof isolation box is no longer a child. She was a little adult, a war veteran in a polka dot dress navigating a minefield of emotional and physical abuse, while the rest of the country looked at her and saw a fairy tale. The fixers at the studio ensured that none of this ever leaked to the press. The magazines were filled with stories of her idyllic life, her dolls, her pony, her loving parents. It was a carefully constructed propaganda campaign designed to protect the asset's value. The public needed to believe in the fantasy. They needed to believe that somewhere in this broken, hungry country, there was a child who was purely, unadulteratedly happy. To shatter that illusion would be to destroy the last shred of hope the audience had. So the teeth were capped, the tears were dried, and the door to the black box was kept firmly shut, hiding the monster in the dark. But as Shirley navigated this labyrinth of expectations and abuse, a pivotal moment approached, a moment that would shatter the last remnant of her childhood magic, not with physical pain, but with a psychological betrayal so profound it would change her view of the world forever. It happened in a department store, under the guise of a holiday celebration, where the line between the person and the product would be erased completely. The world outside the studio gates was a landscape of gray desperation, but inside the bubble of 20th Century Fox, the machinery of fantasy hummed with a relentless, golden efficiency. By 1935, Shirley Temple was not merely a movie star. She was an industry unto herself. She was a singular economic force that rivaled major corporations, a tiny, dimpled titan whose image was stamped onto cereal boxes, stitched into dresses, and molded into millions of porcelain dolls that stared back from the shelves of every department store in America. But while the merchandise was mass-produced, the girl herself was singular, trapped in a rapidly shrinking space between the character she played and the child she was desperately trying to be. The studio had successfully colonized her body with their dental drills and colonized her mind with the terror of the black box. But there remained one final frontier: her belief. They needed to strip mine her innocence to ensure that she understood the brutal transactional nature of her existence. They didn't do this explicitly. The world did it for them. And the moment of final disillusionment arrived wrapped in the red velvet and white fur of a Christmas fable. It was the height of the holiday season, a time when the myth of Shirley Temple was at its most potent. She was the nation's Christmas angel, the face on millions of greeting cards. Her mother Gertrude, perhaps trying to simulate a fragment of a normal childhood, took Shirley to a sprawling department store in downtown Los Angeles to see Santa Claus. For a brief shining moment, the little general of the Fox lot was allowed to be a civilian. She was trembling with a genuine, unscripted excitement, clutching her coat, rehearsing the wish she wanted to whisper into the ear of Saint Nick. In her mind, despite the lights and the cameras and the screaming fans, magic still existed. There was still a figure in the world who didn't work for the payroll department, someone who existed purely to give, not to take. The line was long, snake-like, winding through the aisles of toys that bore her own face. When she finally reached the front, the air thick with the scent of pine and cheap perfume, she stepped up to the throne. She looked up at the man in the red suit, her eyes wide, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was the keeper of lists, the judge of naughty and nice. But Santa didn't ask her what she wanted. He didn't offer a ho-ho-ho or a candy cane. He didn't look at her with the benevolent, twinkling eyes of a timeless guardian. Instead, the man shifted his weight, reached into the deep pocket of his red coat, and pulled out a fountain pen and a crumpled piece of paper. He leaned forward, breaking the character, breaking the fourth wall of childhood, and asked in a gruff, tired voice, "Miss Temple, can I have your autograph?" The silence that followed was louder than any director's megaphone. In that fraction of a second, the universe shifted on its axis. The magic didn't just fade, it evaporated violently. Shirley stood frozen, the pen hovering in the space between them like a weapon. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Santa Claus was a fan. Santa Claus was a subordinate. There was no North Pole. There was only Hollywood and its vast, sprawling suburbs. The man wasn't a magical being. He was just another adult who wanted a piece of her, another person who saw her not as a child to be delighted, but as a celebrity to be exploited. She signed the paper. She always signed the paper. The conditioning of the black box ensured compliance even in the midst of heartbreak. But as she walked away, leaving the department store Santa beaming at his souvenir, something inside her calcified. She later recalled this moment as the instant her childhood truly ended. She realized that the world was a stage, and everyone, even the mythical figures of folklore, was reading from a script. If Santa wasn't real, then safety wasn't real. If the symbol of unconditional giving was actually a taker, then every relationship was transactional. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She was a business partner in the enterprise of her own life. This cynical awakening was compounded by the surreal horror of the merchandising machine that surrounded her. By the mid-1930s, the Shirley Temple doll was the most coveted object in the Western world. These weren't just toys. They were effigies. They were perfect porcelain replicas of her, complete with the hazel eyes, the ringlets, and the dimples. Shirley would often walk through stores and see rows upon rows of herself staring back, hundreds of dead, glassy eyes reflecting her own face. It created a bizarre dissociation, a fracturing of identity that few psychologists of the era could even begin to understand. She wasn't just Shirley. She was the Shirley Temple. She was an object that could be bought, sold, dressed, and undressed by millions of strangers. She was owned by the public in a way that was visceral and terrifyingly physical. The adoration of the fans was not a warm embrace, it was a feeding frenzy. When she appeared in public, the crowds didn't just want to see her, they wanted to consume her. They wanted proof that she was real. This desire manifested in a disturbing phenomenon that became a regular hazard of her life, the pecking. Grown women, overcome by a hysterical mixture of love and skepticism, would swarm around her small frame. They couldn't believe that a child could be this perfect, this polished. Rumors swirled in the tabloids, fueled by European critics, that Shirley Temple was not a child at all, but a 30-year-old dwarf with surgically implanted teeth and a wig. To test this theory, or perhaps simply to own a piece of the divine, fans would lunge at her. They would reach out with grabbing hands to pinch her cheeks until they bruised, to lift her dress to see if she had the body of a woman, or most painfully, to yank at her golden curls to see if they were a wig. Gertrude Temple's paranoia, often dismissed as the neurosis of a stage mother, was in fact a rational response to this madness. The loaded gun in her purse was not a prop, it was a necessity. Shirley learned to move through crowds with her elbows tucked in, flinching at the sudden movements of strangers. She was a national treasure, but she was treated like public property, a statue that everyone felt entitled to chip a piece off of. The physical boundaries that protect a normal child, the "don't touch" rule, did not apply to her. She belonged to the audience, and the audience was a rough, hungry beast. While the fans tried to tear her apart from the outside, the studio was making critical errors that would seal her fate from the inside. The late 1930s brought a shift in the cinematic landscape. The era of the Depression was waning, and with it, the public's appetite for sugary, simplistic morality tales began to fade. The audience was maturing, but Fox refused to let Shirley mature with them. They were terrified of breaking the mold. To them, she was a static asset, a timeless cherub. They kept her in the short, polka-dot dresses long after her peers had graduated to slacks and gowns. They forced her to play innocent toddlers, even as her body began to lengthen and change. The greatest missed opportunity and the heartbreak that would define her career's trajectory came in 1938. MGM was casting for a film based on a popular children's book, The Wizard of Oz. They wanted Shirley Temple for the role of Dorothy. It was perfect. It was the role she was born to play, the innocent girl swept away to a magical land. It would have been the bridge, the vehicle that allowed her to transition from a toddler star to a young adolescent legend. But 20th Century Fox, driven by greed and a possessive fear of sharing their gold mine, refused to loan her out. They wouldn't let their prize asset generate money for a rival studio. The role went to Judy Garland. While Garland was immortalized in Technicolor singing "Over the Rainbow" and stepping into cinematic history, Shirley was stuck at Fox, churning out recycled scripts like Little Miss Broadway and Just Around the Corner. The films were stale. The formula was broken. The magic that had sustained the studio was running on fumes. Shirley watched from the sidelines as the cultural zeitgeist moved on without her, a painful lesson in the short-sightedness of corporate greed. She was the biggest star in the world, yet she was powerless to choose her own destiny, held captive by contracts that treated her like a piece of furniture rather than an artist. And then the inevitable enemy arrived. It was an enemy that no amount of dental work, no black box, and no studio executive could defeat: puberty. It struck with the quiet, devastating inevitability of a ticking clock. As the 1930s bled into the 1940s, nature came to collect its due. Shirley's face, once the perfect circle of infancy, began to lean out. Her body, the sexless vessel of national hope, began to develop curves. The ringlets, once bouncy and defiance of gravity, started to look ridiculous, like a costume on a grown woman. For any other child, this is a time of awkward discovery. For Shirley Temple, it was a professional apocalypse. The studio executives watched the dailies with growing horror. They viewed her development not as a natural process, but as a depreciation of assets. They panicked. They tried to hide it. They bound her chest. They pinned her hair. They wrote scripts where she acted younger, talked simpler, trying to freeze time in a desperate attempt to keep the cash register ringing. But the camera does not lie. The audience saw it. The sexualized angel that had been subconsciously acceptable when she was 6 became uncomfortable, even grotesque, when she was 12. The public, who had worshipped the toddler, recoiled from the adolescent. They didn't want a teenage Shirley Temple. They didn't want to see their baby grow up. They felt betrayed, as if by aging she had broken a promise to remain their eternal innocent pet. The reviews turned nasty. The box office receipts plummeted. The same executives who had bowed at her feet, who had bought mansions with the money she earned, now looked at her with cold, dead eyes. The whispers in the commissary grew louder. She's finished. She's washed up. She's awkward. The golden goose hadn't just stopped laying eggs. She had become an embarrassment. By 1940, the writing was on the wall, scrawled in red ink. 20th Century Fox, the studio she had saved from ruin. The studio that had built its foundation on her grinded teeth and frozen tears decided it was time to cut their losses. They didn't offer a transition plan. They didn't offer support. They simply prepared to discard the husk of the child they had consumed. Shirley was 12 years old. She had worked for nearly a decade, generated millions of dollars, and sacrificed her childhood on the altar of Hollywood. And she was about to learn the final, most brutal lesson of the studio system. Loyalty is a one-way street, and when a product expires, you throw it in the trash. The black box had trained her to fear the dark, but she was about to be cast out into a different kind of darkness, the cold, indifferent shadow of irrelevance. The axe fell not with a scream, but with a whisper in a boardroom. There was no gold watch, no farewell parade, no montage of her greatest hits played to a tearful audience. There was just a meeting between men in suits who looked at the bottom line, saw the red ink, and decided to liquidate the inventory. In 1940, Shirley Temple's parents were informed that 20th Century Fox, the studio that Shirley had literally built brick by brick with the sweat of her childhood, was declining to renew her contract. The news was delivered with the clinical detachment of a foreclosure. The executives didn't look her in the eye. How could they? To look at her was to see the ghost of the fortune they had spent, the yacht they had bought, the empire they had secured. It was easier to look at the paperwork. They sent her home. At 12 years old, Shirley Temple was officially a has-been. She was thrust into the one environment she was completely unprepared for, the real world. Her parents, perhaps in a misguided attempt at normalcy, enrolled her in the Westlake School for Girls. It was supposed to be a soft landing. It was a Shark Tank. Shirley walked onto the campus not as a student, but as an alien species. She had never been around children her own age without a script. She didn't know the slang. She didn't know the social hierarchy. She only knew how to hit a mark and memorize a line. The other girls, the daughters of Los Angeles' elite, smelled blood. They didn't see a movie star. They saw a freak. They saw the girl their mothers had forced them to emulate, the perfect doll they had been compared to their entire lives. And now they had her within striking distance. They teased her mercilessly. They mocked her clothes, her voice, her outdated ringlets. Shirley, who could tap dance with Bill Bojangles Robinson and cry on cue for a director, found herself utterly defenseless against the cruelty of seventh graders. She would come home and cry, not the pretty single-tear cry of the movies, but the ugly, heaving sobs of a lonely child. She realized that the love of the public was a phantom. Without the screen, she was just a short, awkward girl with a resume that nobody in the playground cared about. But the industry wasn't quite done with her. Like a gambler trying to win back a fortune on a bad hand, other studios thought they could fix her. MGM signed her. David O. Selznick, the legendary producer of Gone with the Wind, thought he could mold her into a teenage star. He was wrong. The agonizing years of her adolescence were captured on film for the world to pity. They tried to make her sexy. They tried to make her serious. But every time she appeared on screen, the audience felt a collective cognitive dissonance. When she played a romantic interest, it felt wrong, bordering on illicit. When she kissed a boy on screen, the audience recoiled. They didn't want to see their baby with a boyfriend. They wanted her to stay 6 years old forever. She was trapped in the amber of their nostalgia. In films like Kathleen and Miss Annie Rooney, you can see the desperation in her eyes. She is acting harder than she ever has, trying to break through the invisible wall of her own legacy. But the magic was gone. The camera, which had once been her lover, was now her judge. It magnified her awkwardness. It lingered on the baby fat. It highlighted the fact that the spark was dimming. She was working for a paycheck now, a journeyman laborer in a factory where she used to be the owner. Desperate to escape the suffocating control of her mother and the humiliation of her fading career, Shirley did what many teenage girls do when they feel trapped. She fell in love with the first man who looked like a ticket out. His name was John Ager. He was tall, he was handsome, and he was an Army Air Corps sergeant. He was a uniform, a jawline, and a promise of adulthood. To Shirley, he was Prince Charming. He was the only person who looked at her and seemed to see a woman, not a doll. She projected all her hopes for freedom onto his broad shoulders. She didn't just want a husband, she wanted a getaway driver. They were married in 1945. Shirley was 17. The wedding was a national event, a media circus that rivaled a royal coronation. Thousands of fans lined the streets, screaming her name, trying to touch the hem of her gown. It looked like the happy ending to the movie of her life. The little orphan had found her prince. The credits should have rolled right there, but life doesn't have credits. It has mornings after. The marriage was a disaster before the rice had even been swept off the church steps. John Ager was not a villain, but he was a man wholly unequipped to be Mr. Shirley Temple. He was a soldier returning from war, looking for a wife to keep his house. Instead, he found himself married to a corporation. He couldn't go to dinner without being interrupted. He couldn't walk down the street without photographers blinding him. He was emasculated by her fame, dwarfed by her shadow. And he had a vice that the studio publicists couldn't hide: alcohol. The drinking started early and escalated quickly. The fairy tale cottage became a war zone. Agar, resentful of her success and his own obscurity, became volatile. He was jealous of the attention she received, yet simultaneously eager to exploit it, to launch his own acting career. He rode her coattails into Hollywood, landing roles because of his last name, which only deepened his self-loathing. Shirley found herself in a new kind of prison. She had traded the tyranny of her mother for the volatility of a drunk husband. She was living the classic Hollywood tragedy. The public adored her, but in her own home, she walked on eggshells. She became a mother herself, giving birth to a daughter, Linda Susan, hoping that a baby would fix the marriage. It didn't. It just raised the stakes. The black box of her childhood had been cold and silent. The box of her marriage was loud and smelled of gin. She was trapped in a cycle of arguments, slammed doors, and police visits. The girl who had been conditioned to smile through physical pain was now smiling through emotional disintegration. She kept up the facade for the cameras, posing for happy family photos, while her private life crumbled into dust. By 1949, the charade was over. The divorce was filed. The headlines were brutal. Shirley Temple's fairy tale marriage ends. The public, who had felt a proprietary ownership over her happiness, felt let down. They blamed her. They whispered that she must be difficult, that the spoiled child star couldn't keep a man. She was 21 years old, a divorcee, and a single mother. In the conservative morality of mid-century America, she was damaged goods. Her film career had effectively flatlined. She appeared in a few final films, notably Fort Apache with John Wayne and The Bachelor and The Bobby Soxer with Cary Grant. She was good in them, competent, charming, professional. But she wasn't Shirley Temple anymore. She was just another actress, and not a particularly bankable one. The specialness had evaporated. In 1950, at the age of 22, Shirley Temple stared into the mirror and made a decision that terrified her agents and baffled the world. Most people are just starting their lives at 22. They are graduating college, starting entry-level jobs, finding themselves. Shirley had already lived a lifetime. She'd been the most famous person on the planet, earned millions, lost millions, married, divorced, and become a mother. She was exhausted. She was old in her soul. She looked at the reflection, the face that belonged to the world, the smile that had been bought and paid for, and she decided she was done renting it out. She retired. It wasn't a pause, it wasn't a hiatus, it was a full stop. She walked into the studio, cleaned out her locker, and walked away from the only life she had ever known. She turned her back on the lights, the applause, and the intoxicating, poisonous drug of fame. She chose obscurity. She chose silence. The silence was deafening. For the first time in her life, there was no schedule, no call time, no mother with a gun, no director with a box of ice. There was just Shirley, alone in a house, with a checking account that was shockingly smaller than the public imagined. Her father, who had managed her finances, had made bad investments. The fortune was largely gone, evaporated into the ether of bad deals and lifestyle maintenance. She was a 22-year-old retiree with a child to feed and no skills other than tap dancing and crying on cue. The world waited for the inevitable crash. They waited for the drug overdose, the suicide attempt, the sordid affair, the typical third act of the child star tragedy. They had the obituaries pre-written, the headlines drafted. The little princess falls. But they didn't know Shirley Temple. They forgot about the conditioning. They forgot about the steel that had been forged in the freezing cold of the isolation booth. They forgot that she had learned to survive before she learned to read. The studio had tried to break her, to control her, but they had inadvertently created something else, a survivor. Shirley didn't crumble. She didn't look for a bottle. She looked for a second act. She looked at the wreckage of her first life not as a grave, but as a foundation. She realized that playing a role was easy, living a life was hard, and she was ready to do the hard work. She met a man named Charles Black. He was the antithesis of Hollywood. He was a businessman, a naval intelligence officer, a man of substance who had never seen a Shirley Temple movie. When they met, he didn't ask for an autograph. He asked her who she was, and for the first time in her life, Shirley had to find an answer that didn't come from a script. She married him, becoming Shirley Temple Black. She moved to the suburbs. She bought a station wagon. She became a mother to 2 more children. To the neighbors, she was just Mrs. Black, the nice lady who volunteered at the PTA and organized charity drives. She scrubbed the makeup off her face and let her hair go gray. She allowed herself to be ordinary. But ordinary was never going to be enough for a woman who had once commanded the attention of presidents. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the world was changing. The political landscape was shifting. And Shirley, watching from her suburban living room, felt a familiar stir. Not the itch for applause, but the itch for purpose. She looked at the television, not at the movies, but at the news. She saw a world in chaos, a world that needed managing, and she realized she had a set of skills that no one else had. She knew how to charm hostile strangers. She knew how to memorize complex briefings. She knew how to smile while standing on a block of ice. She knew how to navigate the egos of powerful, insecure men. She wasn't an actress anymore. She was a diplomat in training. The world thought the story of Shirley Temple was over. They thought the book had closed when the screen went black. They were wrong. The movie star was dead. But the woman was just waking up. The little girl who had been used as a tool of diplomacy by Roosevelt was about to decide that she would no longer be the tool. She would be the hand that wielded it. The suburbs of Woodside, California, in the early 1960s were quiet, manicured, and safe. a perfect sterile cage for a woman who had survived the lion's den. Shirley Temple Black was playing the role of her life, the invisible housewife. She drove the carpool, she organized the charity balls, she decorated the Christmas tree. To the outside world, the little princess had found her happy ending. She had faded into the beige tapestry of domestic anonymity. But silence, for Shirley, had always been a trap. It reminded her too much of the soundproof box. As the decade turned and the world outside her window caught fire, Vietnam, civil rights, the assassination of Kennedy, the restlessness began to gnaw at her. She watched the news with the critical eye of a woman who knew that history was just a script written by the winners. She saw men in suits making decisions that sent boys to die in jungles, and she recognized the performance. She recognized the ego. She had spent her childhood sitting on the laps of the most powerful men in the world, newspaper tycoons, studio heads, presidents. She knew a secret that the rest of the electorate didn't. Great men were just little boys who needed reassurance. So when she decided to step out of the kitchen and into the political arena, the laughter was immediate and cruel. When she announced her run for Congress in 1967, the media descended like wolves who had found an old bone. They didn't treat her as a candidate, they treated her as a novelty act. The headlines were patronizing masterpieces of sexism. The lollipop candidate, Shirley Temple to run on the good ship Lollipop. They asked her about her dimples, not her policies. They asked her if she would tap dance on the House floor. The political establishment, a club of gray men in gray suits, rolled their eyes. They expected a ditz, a washed-up actress looking for one last round of applause. They didn't realize they were dealing with a woman who had stared down Louis B. Mayer before she could do long division. She lost that first congressional race, but in losing, she learned the rules of the new game. She realized that her fame was a double-edged sword. It could get her in the room, but it gave everyone in that room permission to dismiss her. She had to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. She hit the books. She studied international relations with the same obsessive perfectionism she had once applied to her tap routines. She memorized geopolitical data like lines in a script. Her redemption came from an unlikely source, Richard Nixon. In 1969, the president appointed her as a delegate to the United Nations. The diplomatic corps gasped. It was seen as a joke, a celebrity appointment to distract the public. When she walked into the UN General Assembly for the first time, the skepticism in the room was palpable. The ambassadors from the Soviet bloc, the career diplomats from Europe, they all looked at her and saw the girl in the polka dot dress. They smiled polite, condescending smiles. They prepared to pat her on the head. But Shirley Temple Black didn't need their approval. She needed their underestimation. She used her mask with lethal precision. She let them see the smile. She let them think she was soft, and then, while they were disarmed by the nostalgia, she outmaneuvered them. She was punctual, she was prepared, and she was relentless. She sat in committee meetings for hours without a break, a stamina forged in the 18-hour days of her childhood. When others flagged, she kept going. She knew how to negotiate with bullies because she had been raised by them. Her first true test of fire came in 1974 when she was appointed U.S. ambassador to Ghana. The whispers started again. Sending Shirley Temple to Africa? It's an insult. The critics claimed she had no experience, that she would be eaten alive by the complex post-colonial politics of West Africa. Ghana was a nation navigating the turbulent waters of independence, flirting with socialism and deeply suspicious of American imperialism. They didn't need a movie star, they needed a statesman. Shirley arrived in Accra not with an entourage, but with a notepad. She didn't preach, she listened. She traveled into the bush, into the marketplaces, places where traditional ambassadors in limousines never ventured, and she discovered something remarkable. The movies that had been her prison were her passport. In remote villages where people had never seen a television, they knew her face. The old reels of her films had been played on portable projectors in the dust for decades. To the people of Ghana, she wasn't a symbol of American capitalism. She was a symbol of joy. The recognition gave her an access that no career diplomat could buy. She used that warmth to open doors, but once inside, she was all business. She negotiated trade deals, navigated coups, and managed the delicate ego of the Ghanaian leadership with a deft hand. She later famously said, "I have no trouble with dictators. I grew up in Hollywood." It wasn't a joke. It was a statement of fact. The capricious, power-hungry leaders she encountered on the world stage were just different versions of the studio executives who had owned her. She knew how to let a man feel powerful while she quietly got exactly what she wanted. She knew that the black box of diplomacy was just another cold room she had to survive until the lights came back on. But just as she was cementing her reputation as a formidable political operator, her own body, the vessel that had been public property for 40 years, betrayed her. In 1972, she found a lump in her left breast. Today, we see pink ribbons everywhere. We have walks for the cure. Celebrities discuss their health on Instagram. But in 1972, the word cancer was not spoken in polite society. It was a death sentence whispered in darkened rooms. And for a woman, a mastectomy was a source of deep Victorian shame. It was viewed as a mutilation, a loss of womanhood that was to be hidden at all costs. The protocol was silence. Go to the hospital under a fake name, have the surgery, stuff the bra with cotton, and never ever talk about it. Shirley Temple Black looked at the doctor, then she looked at the silence that was expected of her. And she decided to break the script one more time. She was the first famous woman in history to go public with her breast cancer diagnosis. She didn't issue a vague statement. She invited the press into her hospital room. She sat there, bandaged, vulnerable, stripped of the glamour, and she looked into the camera. She spoke the word mastectomy clearly and without shame. She told the women of America, "Don't be afraid. Go to the doctor. Don't sit home and be afraid." It was a seismic cultural moment. The girl who had been tortured to maintain physical perfection was now showing the world her scars. She was reclaiming her body. For decades, her body had been a commodity for Fox. Teeth grinded, hair dyed, chest bound. Now with one breast gone, she was finally fully, unequivocally the owner of her own skin. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of letters poured in. Suicide hotlines were flooded not with despair, but with women seeking help. Doctors reported a massive spike in women coming in for exams. She didn't just save her own life, she saved thousands of others. She turned her personal tragedy into a public service, using the fame that had once enslaved her as a beacon to guide others out of the dark. She recovered and she went back to work. She had proven she could survive the studio system, she could survive the critics, and she could survive cancer. But the final act of her life was waiting in a place that held a strange, poetic resonance with her past. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush appointed her ambassador to Czechoslovakia. It seemed like a quiet post for a twilight career. Czechoslovakia was a gray communist bloc nation, frozen in the grip of the Soviet Union. It was a country of surveillance, of secret police, of silence. It was a country that lived in a political black box. Shirley arrived in Prague with her husband, Charles. She settled into the embassy, expecting a standard diplomatic tour of cocktail parties and trade agreements. But she had walked into the middle of a hurricane. The winds of change were blowing through Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall was trembling, and in the cobblestone streets of Prague, the students were beginning to whisper about freedom. Shirley watched the unrest with a keen eye. She saw the fear in the eyes of the government officials. She saw the hope in the eyes of the dissidents, and she realized that she was about to witness the one thing Hollywood could never manufacture, a true revolution. But she wasn't just a witness. As the U.S. ambassador, she was a player. She made it clear which side she was on. She didn't hide in the embassy. She walked the streets. She met with dissidents, including the playwright Václav Havel, a man who had been imprisoned for his words. She gave them legitimacy. She gave them cover. When the secret police trailed her car, she didn't speed up. She slowed down and waved. She treated the apparatus of terror with the disdain of a woman who had seen the zipper on the monster costume. Then came November 1989, the Velvet Revolution. The streets of Prague filled with hundreds of thousands of people. The jingling of keys, the sound of the revolution, rang out against the cold stone buildings. Shirley stood on the balcony of a hotel overlooking Wenceslas Square. Below her, a sea of humanity was chanting for freedom. They were chanting for the end of the darkness. And then something impossible happened. Someone in the crowd spotted her. A murmur went through the mob. It wasn't Ambassador Black, it was Shirleyka. They began to chant her name, Shirleyka, Shirleyka. Here, in the middle of a violent, history-altering revolution, the image of the little girl who had danced during the Depression became a symbol of liberty for a nation emerging from 40 years of communism. It was the ultimate vindication. The movies that had been made in a factory of abuse were now fueling a moment of pure liberation. Shirley looked down at the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Real tears, not the glycerin drops of her childhood. She wasn't acting. For the first time in her life, she was part of a story where the happy ending was real, where the bad guys lost, and where the people broke out of the box, not because a director yelled, "Cut," but because they kicked the damn door down. She had come full circle. The girl who was locked in the dark had helped turn on the lights for an entire country. The applause in Wenceslas Square was the final curtain call. But this time, the cheers were not for a performance. They were for a witness. When Shirley Temple Black left Czechoslovakia in 1992, she didn't just pack her bags. She packed away a lifetime of proving the world wrong. She returned to California not as a fallen star, nor as a curiosity, but as a woman who had successfully navigated the two most treacherous industries on earth, Hollywood and global politics. She had walked through the fires of both and emerged without the smell of smoke on her clothes. Her final years were defined by a quiet, defiant normalcy. She retreated to her home in Woodside, the sanctuary she had built with Charles. It was a life of aggressive ordinariness, gardening, grandchildren, and the slow, peaceful rhythm of aging. But even in the quiet, the ghost of the little princess was never far away. The world refused to let the girl in the ringlets die. Every Christmas, the movies played. Every day, fan mail arrived from people who still saw her as a 6-year-old. She treated her past self not with shame, but with the distant affection one might have for a younger sister who died long ago. "She's a relative," Shirley would say of her screen persona. "I'm proud of her, but I'm not her." This dissociation was her final survival mechanism. It allowed her to look at the dolls on the shelf, the ones with the uncanny glass eyes, and not feel possessed. It allowed her to remember the dental drill and the black box without crumbling. Unlike Judy Garland, whose tragedy was that she could never separate herself from the rainbow, Shirley had built a firewall between the human being and the brand. Judy died at 47, broken and addicted, a casualty of the machine. Shirley was living into her 80s, clear-eyed and sober, the one who got away. But survival has a cost, and Shirley paid it in silence. When she wrote her autobiography, Child Star, she was honest, but she was controlled. She detailed the abuse, the financial theft by her father, the tyranny of the studio. But she wrote with the cool detachment of a diplomat filing a report. She refused to be a victim. She refused to give the industry the satisfaction of her pity. She told the story of the black box and the grinded teeth, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a testimony of endurance. She wanted the record to show that the smile was work, that the charm was labor, and that the miracle child was actually a survivor of child labor in its most glamorous, grotesque form. On the night of February 10th, 2014, the end came. There was no drama. There were no flashing lights, no screaming paramedics, no TMZ helicopters circling the house. She died at home in her own bed, surrounded by her family and the sound of the Pacific Ocean. She was 85 years old. The news rippled across the world, triggering a wave of nostalgia that felt almost physical. For a moment, the cynicism of the 21st century paused. People remembered the Depression. They remembered the hope she had represented. But amidst the tributes and the clips of her dancing with Bojangles, the true magnitude of her victory was largely overlooked. Her victory wasn't that she was a great actress or even a great ambassador. Her victory was that she died sane. She had been placed in a Skinner box before she could read. She had been armed with a weaponized cuteness and pointed at a desperate nation. She had been robbed of her earnings, robbed of her childhood, and robbed of her physical autonomy. Statistically, she should have ended up in a tragic headline. She should have been a cautionary tale. Instead, she died a matriarch, a woman who had loved and been loved, a woman who had shaped history rather than just being shaped by it. Yet, the scar remains on the face of Hollywood, hidden under the makeup of history. The story of Shirley Temple is the original sin of the modern celebrity machine. It was the moment we decided that a human life was a fair price to pay for our entertainment. We look at the child stars of today, the breakdowns, the rehab stints, the public meltdowns, and we wonder why it happens. It happens because the blueprint was drawn in 1934. It happens because the industry learned that if you can break a child's spirit, you can sell the pieces for millions. Shirley Temple was the prototype. She was the proof of concept. And while she escaped the factory, the machinery she helped build is still running, grinding up new generations of children who don't have her steel spine. In the end, the image that lingers is not the girl on the good ship Lollipop. It is the image of a 6-year-old girl sitting in the dark on a block of ice, shivering in the silence of a soundproof box. It is the image of a child learning that the only way to get warm is to dance. She melted the ice. She broke down the door. She walked out of the dark and into a life of her own making. But if you listen closely to the tap, tap, tapping of those shoes in the old black and white films, you don't just hear the rhythm of a dance. You hear the sound of a prisoner tapping out a code of survival. You hear the grinding of teeth that refused to stop smiling, even when they were filed down to the nerve. She was the angel who killed the doll so the woman could live, and that was her greatest performance of all.